The doors to Westminster had not yet opened when the first whispers tore through the corridors of power like a blade through silk. Something had been found inside Buckingham Palace, something locked behind a wall that no architectural blueprint had ever acknowledged. And whatever the royal guards had pulled from the private quarters of Queen Camilla was already shaking the foundations of the British monarchy to its core. Parliament had been called into emergency session. The word spreading through the halls of Westminster was not scandal, it was exile. And the name attached to that word belonged to the woman sitting on the throne. To understand how Britain arrived at this extraordinary moment, you have to go back several weeks, to the dead hours before dawn, when a royal guard named Fletcher was completing his rounds through the eastern residential corridor of Buckingham Palace. The palace at that hour had a particular quality of silence, not peaceful, but pressurized, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Fletcher had served 8 years in that building. He knew every creak of the floorboards, every draft that slipped beneath the heavy carved doors, every shadow that fell wrong. That night, a shadow fell very wrong indeed. Two figures moved through the far end of the corridor with the practiced invisibility of people who had done this many times before. They were staff members Fletcher recognized from Camilla's personal household, a tight unit that answered only to her and operated with a degree of secrecy that had always struck the senior guards as unusual. What stopped Fletcher cold was not the figures themselves, but what they were carrying. A long flat case wrapped in dark cloth, roughly the dimensions of a painting, and behind it a second case, then a third, all moving in the direction of the Queen's private wing, through a passageway that the official palace schematics described as a sealed maintenance access corridor with no usable interior space on the other side. Fletcher said nothing that night. He returned to his post, filed nothing, reported nothing, but the image burned itself into the back of his mind like a brand. Over the following days, he began comparing notes with two other guards who worked the same rotation. What emerged from those quiet conversations was a pattern so consistent it could not be dismissed as coincidence. The security cameras covering the far end of the east residential corridor went offline every single night between 2:45 and 3 in the morning. Not the whole system, not a broad technical fault, precisely those cameras, precisely that window of time. And during that window, movement happened behind a wall that was not supposed to contain anything at all. The fear that spread among that small group of guards was not the ordinary fear of men who had stumbled into palace politics. It ran deeper than that. It was the primal unease of people who had discovered that the architecture of the building they protected was lying to them, that somewhere inside the most scrutinized residence in Britain, a space existed that had been deliberately erased from every official record. And inside that space, something was being moved, maintained, and fiercely protected by the most private staff of the most powerful woman in the country. It was the senior captain of the Eastern Guard, a career soldier named Graves, who finally broke the silence. He did not go to palace administration. He did not file a security report. He requested through back channels a private meeting with Prince William. The request came with a single handwritten line that read, "There is a room in this palace that does not exist, and I believe you need to know what is inside it." William read that line 3 times, then he cleared his schedule for the following evening. The meeting took place in William's private study, a room deliberately chosen for its distance from the Queen's wing and its lack of internal surveillance coverage. Graves spoke for 40 minutes. He laid out the timeline of camera failures, the witness accounts of the late-night movements, the physical description of the sealed corridor, and his own growing conviction that whatever lay behind that wall had been placed there with enormous care and protected with institutional precision. William listened without interrupting. His expression gave nothing away, but when Graves finished, the prince sat in silence for a long moment, and the quality of that silence told Graves everything. William was not surprised. He was confirming something he had already begun to suspect. The signs had been accumulating for months. A request William had made to access the archive of his mother's personal correspondence had been quietly denied on administrative grounds. A charitable foundation bearing Diana's name had been restructured in ways that subtly reduced its public visibility. Several pieces of jewelry that William distinctly remembered seeing photographed in formal estate records had vanished from the current inventory without explanation. Each of these things, taken alone, could be rationalized. Taken together, they described a deliberate and sustained effort to thin Diana's presence from the living record of the royal family. And at the center of every one of those erasures sat the same quiet, purposeful hand. William began his investigation with the cold, methodical focus of a man who had decided that hesitation was no longer a luxury he could afford. He pulled the palace's master security schematics under the pretense of reviewing a proposed infrastructure upgrade. He cross-referenced the camera blind spots Graves had identified against the original architectural drawings from the palace's last major renovation. The discrepancy was unmistakable. A space of roughly 40 square meters sat between the outer wall of the east residential corridor and the interior-facing wall of the Queen's private dressing suite. On the renovation drawings, that space was labeled as structural reinforcement cavity, no access. But structural reinforcement cavities did not require camera suppression. They did not require staff to move crated items through them at 3 in the morning. They did not require the loyalty of a personally selected household unit to maintain. He walked the corridor 3 times over 2 days, running his palm along the wall, paneling with a casualness designed to look like idle distraction. On the 3rd pass, he felt it. A section of the dark wooden paneling behind an ornate mounted display case produced a faint hollow resonance under his knuckles that the surrounding panels did not. He pressed along the edges. He found a seam so precisely fitted it was essentially invisible under normal lighting, and at the lower corner of that seam, behind the decorative iron bracket of the display case, his fingers found a recessed mechanism no larger than a thumb. He did not engage it. Not yet. He walked away, returned to his study, and spent the rest of that night constructing a plan with the 2 advisors he trusted most in the world. The night William went back alone, a storm was moving in from the west. Rain hammered the tall windows of the palace's upper floors, and thunder rolled in low across the rooftops in slow, measured waves. He moved through the east corridor at 3:14 in the morning, 4 minutes inside the camera blackout window, carrying nothing but a small torch and the photographs he had already taken of the paneling scene. He found the bracket. He pressed the mechanism. The panel did not swing outward. It withdrew inward, smooth and almost completely silent, on a track so well engineered it made no sound at all beyond the faintest whisper of displaced air. And from that displaced air came something that stopped William's breath completely, the scent of white roses. He had not smelled that particular perfume in over 27 years. It belonged to his mother. He stepped inside. The room beyond the wall was not a storage cavity. It was a chamber carefully lit by a row of small electric candles mounted along the upper cornice, warm and amber and completely invisible from outside. The temperature inside was controlled, noticeably cooler than the corridor, the kind of regulated environment used to preserve delicate materials. Every surface was immaculate. Every object had been placed with the deliberate intentionality of a curator arranging a permanent collection. William swept the torch beam across the room, and his mind went very still in the way that the mind goes still just before it fully processes something it cannot immediately accept. The shelves along the left wall held dozens of leather-bound boxes, each labeled in a small, precise hand. He crossed to the nearest shelf and opened the first box his hand found. Inside, nestled in ivory satin, lay a brooch he recognized immediately, a delicate spray of sapphires set in white gold that Diana had worn in a photograph taken at Kensington Palace in 1989, a photograph that William had kept in his own study for years. He opened another box, a bracelet, another, a pair of drop earrings in rubies and seed pearls. One after another, every piece matched items that had been catalogued as missing from Diana's personal estate following her death, items that the official inventory had eventually written off as unaccounted for. They were not unaccounted for. They had been here in this room for decades. He moved to the writing desk positioned beneath the room's single narrow window. The surface held 3 leather-bound journals arranged side by side in chronological order. He opened the first and recognized the handwriting immediately. Not Diana's. These were records written in the hand of an observer, meticulous, cold, clinical entries documenting interactions, movements, conversations, and vulnerabilities. Diana's routines, her emotional state during difficult periods, the names of people she trusted, the moments when she was most isolated. The entries spanned years and read not like a personal diary but like a surveillance file assembled on a subject of strategic interest. William turned the pages with hands that had gone completely numb and felt something shift permanently inside his chest. Against the far wall, occupying the central position of honor in the entire room, hung a portrait. It was large, nearly full length, set in a gilded frame that had clearly been crafted specifically for this space. Diana stood in the painting, not in any pose that had ever been publicly documented. She was captured in three-quarter profile, her chin lifted, her eyes carrying an expression of absolute, exhausted defiance, dressed in a deep midnight blue gown that William did not recognize from any official record. The brushwork was extraordinary. The painting was extraordinary, and it had been hidden here behind a sealed wall in a room that did not exist, in a palace she had been driven from while she was still alive. William stood before that portrait for a long time, long enough for the storm outside to shift and quiet, long enough for every piece of evidence in that room to arrange itself into a single, unambiguous shape. This was not a collection born of grief. Grief does not catalogue vulnerabilities. Grief does not suppress camera coverage to move crates at 3 a.m. Grief does not cross-reference an inheritance and remove items from the official record with administrative precision. What surrounded him was the architecture of domination. Every object in this room had been taken from Diana not to preserve her memory, but to possess it, to own the final version of who she had been and ensure that version remained locked away from the world forever. He photographed everything. Every shelf, every journal, every jewelry box, every page of the surveillance records, the portrait, the labels, the catalogue system. He worked systematically for over an hour, his movements quiet and unhurried, his mind already moving past the room and toward what came next. When he stepped back through the panel into the corridor, the camera blackout window had 4 minutes remaining. He walked back to his rooms through the dark palace, carrying nothing visible and everything that mattered. He went to Camilla the following morning. She was in her private sitting room when William entered, positioned in the high-backed chair she favored near the east window, a posture she had long cultivated to project effortless authority. The morning light fell across her face and she looked, in that first second before she registered his expression, entirely composed. Then she saw what he was carrying. Not a great stack of documents, but a single photograph printed and placed on top of a sealed envelope. The photograph showed the portrait of Diana hanging on the wall of the room that did not exist. Camilla's composure did not crack gradually, it collapsed. Her entire body registered the shock before her face could construct any defense, a sudden contraction, as though all the careful structure of her public self had been pulled from underneath her at once. What followed was not a conversation. It was a confession delivered in fragments, each one more damaging than the last. She did not deny the room. She could not. She tried, briefly, to frame what she had done as protection, as a form of management of a complicated legacy during a sensitive institutional transition. But William did not move and did not speak, and the silence he maintained was its own form of pressure, absolute and immovable. She spoke until she had nothing left to offer, and then the room went quiet in a way that felt permanent. William went directly to the Privy Council. The emergency session convened within 24 hours. The evidence was presented in full, not in summary, not selectively, but in its entirety, including the catalogue of missing estate items, the surveillance journals, the camera suppression records, the maintenance logs of the hidden chamber, and the photographic documentation of every object inside it. The council members received the evidence in a silence that was itself a verdict, dense and unbreathable, and building toward a conclusion that every person in that room already knew was coming. The discussion that followed was brief. The deliberation was not. When the formal recommendation was carried to Parliament, both chambers moved with a speed that had not been seen in British constitutional procedure in living memory. The evidence had done what arguments and politics never could. It had unified. The vote, when it came, was not close. The motion carried with a majority that removed any ambiguity about what the nation's representatives believed had occurred and what they believed the appropriate response must be. Camilla's formal royal duties were suspended immediately and completely. Her access to crown properties was revoked. The mechanisms of a discreet but legally binding removal from British soil were set in motion within hours of the final count. When the outcome reached Camilla, she was alone. No advisors, no staff, no carefully managed audience for the performance of dignified acceptance. She received the news standing in the center of her sitting room, and when the messenger left and the door closed behind him, the woman who remained in that room bore almost no resemblance to the composed and untouchable figure she had maintained for decades. The fury that moved through her was not the hot, impulsive fury of someone caught in a moment of weakness. It was old. It had been there a long time, compressed under years of strategic patience, and now that it had nothing left to compress it, nothing left to protect or preserve or maneuver around, it surfaced with a cold, structural intensity that was far more frightening than any outburst could have been. She did not rage. She did not weep. She made a single phone call to a number that almost no one in Britain knew existed, and then she left. William stood at the window of his study that evening as the last light left the sky above London. The portrait had been removed from the hidden room and placed in the official royal collection under Diana's name, where it should have been from the beginning. The jewellery had been catalogued and returned to the estate. The journals had been secured as evidence. Everything that had been taken was, insofar as it was possible, being given back. He knew that what had happened was not an ending. The vote had been passed, the removal ordered, the record partially restored. But Camilla had walked out of that building with something none of the proceedings had managed to take from her: the knowledge of exactly which pressure points, which secrets, which fractures inside the institution were deep enough to exploit, and the fury of someone who had spent her entire life clawing toward a position of permanence, only to have it removed by the son of the woman she had spent decades trying to erase. The peace that followed was real, but William understood precisely what it had cost, and precisely how fragile the ground beneath it was. Whatever came next would not arrive through official channels. It would not come with a warning. He turned from the window, and the city stretched out below him, lit and vast, and completely unaware of how close it had come to never knowing the truth at all.